Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to welcome all of you, thank you, to this public lecture, which forms part of the conference Contemporary Jewish Life in a Global Modernity, Comparative European Perspectives on a Changing Diaspora. When we were looking for a speaker for this evening's public lecture who deals with our conference central themes in her work, we were very quickly honed in on the well-known Paris-based historian and author Diana Pinto. She's no doubt known to many of you in this room, not least because of her book, Israel is Moved, the German version of which was published by Zukunft in 2013, and which she also launched here in the museum last year. A quick glance at Diana Pinto's work suffices to make clear why we invited her to speak here tonight. She's not only, without question, one of the most prominent thinkers who has written about the opportunities and challenges faced by Jews in contemporary Europe since the 1990s. At the same time, she has also held numerous functions which distinguish her as someone for whom the project of a pluralistic, democratically constituted Europe is particularly close to her heart. She has been the director of the Voices for the Respublika project at the Institute for Jewish Policy Research in London. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, she was editor-in-chief of a pan-European review for the General Republic Belvedere and subsequently a consultant to the political directorate of the Council of Europe on Civil Society in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. It is in the light of all this that we asked her to present something this evening which is connected with both our conference as well as her own work, namely the possibly critical revision of her vision of a European Jewry as the third pillar of the Jewish world, a vision which she formulated in the 1990s. This vision is not only marked by a great optimism as far as both the development of Europe itself as well as that of the Jews in Europe are concerned. It also contains reflections on phenomena and concepts which to this day continue in their various ways to feature in political debates and academic discussions. It also covers the concept of Jewish space, which has become, as we've seen this afternoon, an important point of reference for scholarly research. Equally, it encompasses her outline of the voluntary Jew, whose form of existence only became conceivable against the background of a prolonged historical process, namely the gradual integration of the Holocaust into the consciousness of individual European countries. The concept of voluntary Jews contains the understanding of Jewishness as an integral component of civil society, where Jews can define for themselves what being Jewish means. This opens up the concept not just for a flexible understanding of Jewish identity, whether it have a religious, cultural, intellectual, ethnic, or political basis. Through this concept, Diana Pinto also addresses the fact that Jews, like all other citizens of Europe, have at their disposal multiple identities and multiple loyalties, without these different forms of belonging having to contradict one another. I'm excited to see how you evaluate these reflections today with the insight and experiences of the past decades and the varied conflicts and crises within and outside of Europe, which have represented not just opportunities for European Jews, but which have also, especially in this year, tested and challenged them. At this point, I was supposed to say I'm also just as excited to see how the Viennese-based philosopher Isolde Karim will respond to Diana Pinto's remarks. But unfortunately, Isolde Karim is becoming sick today and can't be with us. Whoever wants to read her paper, it is part of your conference map, so you can look it up and you are invited to read it. But instead of having her as a commentator to Diana's speech, we will have the possibility to discuss, all of you, Diana's remarks. So you are all invited after her talk to respond and to ask her some questions. Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry, absolutely sorry. I have forget to thank our conference partner, the Foundation Erinnerung, Verantwortung und Zukunft, for organizing this evening's event. I'm really sorry for that, and I wish you all of you an exhilarating evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having invited me. I'm quite honored and quite panic-stricken at the thought that I've been asked to rethink my childhood errors, or at any rate, my youthful thoughts 20 years later. I shall surprise you, perhaps, by saying that I have reread those words, and I'm not entirely sure they're worthy of an auto-da-fé. So there's more there than might meet the eye immediately, especially in the angst-ridden continent in which we live, and do not forget that I live in Paris. So thank you for still being here, rather than having already disappeared from the radar screen of the Jewish world, to start with. Now, when I originally thought of European Jewry as the third pillar of a Jewish world, along with the United States and Israel, it was optimistic, and I will explain why, but it was not entirely optimistic. It was also based on some acute fears and angst linked to the whole equilibrium of the Jewish world, and I felt that the Jewish presence in Europe had some redeeming values that could balance out some of the consequences of having had a bipolar Israeli-American Jewish understanding of what had happened during the horrible decades of the Nazi regime and, naturally, the Shoah. But my vision of a European Jewry was future-oriented and had several reservations, and I will get back to them later on, because I already imagined that things might not quite turn out to be the way one could hope, given the weight of other pillars and the weight of the very intense prejudices against the word Europe. In some of my earlier articles, I had written and tried to make a distinction between Europe as it was, post-war Europe, and Europe as a Rorschach inkblot, or a fear or an angst that I would like to put in quotation marks. The word European Jewry, the concept, did not exist before 1989. And yes, it existed, but only prefaced by the destruction of. And it dawned on me just this morning that even on that level of the destruction of European Jews, the inequalities between one part of the continent and the other could be quite massive. My personal family, some of whom were in Naples during the war and the Shoah, were freed by September 1943, precisely at the time when Hungarian Jews were still sipping hot chocolate in the Octagon without any vision yet of the horror that would befall them in the months that ensued. So that even at that level, even at the negative level of the destruction of European Jewry, one cannot fully speak of an identical, homogeneous situation. Now, before we reach the burning issues, and I think we will be addressing them tomorrow about the Arab threat, the fact that the Jews are leaving Europe, and so forth, let me try to go back to an understanding. We've talked a lot about Jewish life in Europe today, dynamic, pluralist, versatile. And let's say we take these individual marbles, and now I'm going to try to imagine the shape of the pocket in which one would put them. In other words, the context of this Jewish life inside a wider context. And what would strike immediately is that, like a comet, the concept of the end of European Jewry is back with a vengeance. Anti-Semitism is its motor. Demographics, its fuel. Fear, its propeller. The Schadenfreude, which accompanies these headlines, has to be understood, and one can feel that there is almost a joy in the notion that with 6,000 French Jews making Aliyah or leaving France, the possible end of French Jewry might be in sight, even though that is only 1% of the Jewish population of France, and that somehow, it's some very deep meaning, the whole presence of Jews in this God-forsaken continent, once over, can open up some kind of new possibilities in a Jewish world which I think is more anguished, more divided, more fearful, more tense than in the entire decades of the post-war period. And yet we've heard that the Jewish spaces continue, Jewish life exists in them, and maybe some people can ask, how can it still be going on with all that's happening? But it is still there. Now, I realize that 20 years is nothing from a historian's point of view, but from a human being's point of view, it's quite a lot. So allow me, since I saw so many young faces and panelists today, to bring you back to an age when some of you perhaps were only 10 or 12 years old, which meant 20 years ago. And where did this whole origin of the notion of a new Jewish European presence come from? It is a period exactly 20 years ago, in 1994, the Council of Europe held a conference on Against Intolerance, combating racism, xenophobia, and anti-Semitism. Back then, some of the Scandinavian members of the Council of Europe felt that there was no need to speak about anti-Semitism. It was gone, it had disappeared, and anyway, philosophically, it was only a subset of racism. Because the feeling was that anti-Semitism was something quite different, American powerful institutions came in and co-sponsored the conference, and I referred to the American Jewish Committee. When I got up and produced in that setting my first interpretation of a positive, perhaps future presentation, I was amazed to see that in those optimistic moments, we're still in the Oslo process, American institutions, being more American than Jewish at that point, leapt up with enthusiasm, rushed to me, and had decided to publish my paper in the United States shortly after it appeared in France. And some of the original group is present here. I think naturally of Anthony Lerman. We were even brought to the United States to bring on the happy, good news that there was a new Jewish life in this European continent. Yes, there was enthusiasm, but in reality, the clouds were already there. When the conference met in early March 1994, Baruch Goldstein had just murdered 27 Palestinians at the Cave of the Patriarchs in Hebron. There was a moment of silence. Everyone said, this is the last crazy act. It's just, you know, a small little thing in history. It will be forgotten. We are marching with confidence toward a great future. We now know better. The following year, propelled by this notion that Jews could actually make a future for themselves, a first conference on planning for the future of European Jewry was held in Prague. American Jewish institutions were there. A new group of people, few of us knew, Russian Jews, appeared on the landscape from Russia. And this notion was that one had to plan for this new European Jewry. But there were clouds even then. 2 months later, Rabin was assassinated. But also, there was the beginning of what one can consider to be one of the flaws or the inherent weaknesses of the Jewish European or Jews in Europe presence. There was the American institutional clout that found that they had the moral responsibility to reorganize Jewish life in Europe. There was the beginning of a Russian presence, not all of which was really inside the pluralist democratic categories that were shared by many of the Western European Jews. And there was an Israel on the defensive, looking down on the whole thing as an absolutely ridiculous enterprise. The business of Jews in Europe was to make Aliyah. Now, we now know that the word European was bandied about with pragmatic, geographic, meaning with very little content with respect to some of the key values of the post-war European project. Not only were roundtables set up and creations made for the European Council of Jewish Communities in which you brought in Australia, granted far away and it's not America, but Tunisian Jews who were living under what was actually, as we know, a dictatorship, but one in which they felt somewhat at ease. There was a feeling that Russian Jews were there peddling or selling their future European Asian identity, and many American Jews for whom this was a final moment of making sure that the descendants of the Shoah would be treated well. And I shall be a bit provocative to tell you that the whole thing was run by a bunch of brilliant, dynamic Argentinian Jews who ran around with labels saying Vilnius, or maybe Prague, and maybe Lyon. So that, in a sense, this notion of a European Jewish identity was from the beginning a bit strange and a bit compromised. Furthermore, I would say that between 1994 and 98, the critics, the negative forces, were in what I would call suspended judgment. They were not eager to think of such a European identity, and they did not really necessarily understand on what it was predicated. And it was predicated on a series of values that, as Karen pointed out already, meant that Jews were full-fledged citizens, no one would ever accuse them of double loyalty, free to move about as they wanted, as voluntary Jews, in a context where Oslo had put Israel in the backlight. One wasn't thinking about that, so one was free to think about European Jews. But let's not forget, in 1994 was the year in which the Vatican recognized Israel. We now assume that it's obvious that popes come and go to the Wailing Wall. But until 1994, there were no diplomatic relations between the Vatican and Israel. So Israel was in a bubble of enthusiasm. Europe seemed to be constructed, and the critics were in suspended judgment. What went wrong? Well, Europe, perhaps, was too small for a globalized world and too large for a close, warm identity. And these grassroots elements that are still with us started developing and existing, but they were not perceived as symbolic of anything super meaningful. The European sphere was perceived slowly to be too weak. And by the end of the 1990s, and then, of course, with the watershed of 2000 and the second Intifada, and the beginning of the Durban conferences on anti-racism, there was a feeling that that particular European dream had collapsed. But at the same time, one can ask oneself, those predicates, those preconditions with which Jews could make a good life for themselves in Europe, and I'm speaking here more as a historian and a political scientist than as a Jewish organizer, which I'm not, were still there, and they still remain. The proof of it is that Jewish life has moved along. Jewish spaces, Jewish museums, Jewish Holocaust memorials have been erected everywhere. And somehow it seemed as though Europe was pacifying itself with respect to its past. What happened with the Second Intifada and the coming forth of Israel as the major concern of the entire Jewish world is that there was an immediate angst crossing all Jews around the world and Jews across Europe that developed quite rapidly what I would call medieval reflexes. What do I mean by that? A congenital fear of the vox populi. The vox populi, if you remember, were after all those who bashed and destroyed the Jewish communities on their way to the Crusades. The people who would come together and create pre-modern medieval pogroms in medieval Italian towns. Hatred coming out in the street and being feared. But this vox populi now became more refined. It was assumed to be the European Parliament, national governments, the press, actors in society. And who was standing behind the Jews? Leaders of their respective states, supporting the Jews, trying to defend them, and think of them in the Jewish mindset as the bishops of yore. When the Crusaders went through killing all along the Rhine, there were bishops defending in fortresses Jews. They didn't do it with much love. They did it because of the Augustinian notion of the Jews having to be around for the final days. But they did it nevertheless. And somewhere in a profound understanding of Europe, there was this understanding that maybe some of the political leaders were in reality the bishops of today. These are the same years, however, in which American politics, I mean the United States government, pushed by people who were often Jews, many called subsequently the Bolsheviks of democracy, proceeded to go into Iraq in 2003. And when some European governments said no, they were immediately accused of redoing a Munich bis and of being, as always, anti-Semitic against the Jews, because in an amazing manner, which one would really need a psychoanalyst to understand, George Bush and co. were convinced that they could redo Iraq, but of course, 50 years of post-war, 45 years of post-war Europe had never corrected the drug addict of anti-Semitism. Consequently, they could ascribe to Iraq redeeming possibilities, while Europe was a dead, lost cause. Nothing had gone on. Anti-Semitism was on the full rise, and the anti-Semitism referred to back in 2003 was, of course, linked to the Arab immigrants or the Muslims in Europe, but at that point it was still seen and perceived to be, in the West, very closely knit to the extreme right. Now, Jews were once again hostages to prejudices, and anti-Semitic Europe rose to the surface. Not Europe with anti-Semitism, but anti-Semitic Europe, which is a very important grammatical, lexical distinction. The clash between the European project, in which I did see that there were important values of historical reconciliation, the absolute value of citizenship, the lack of ethnic identities, the notion that you could no longer have a Volksgesetz. These were the values upon which the European continent had predicated itself, and which made Jewish life possible across the borders. Naturally, this never again was not philosophically compatible with the Jewish world's Israeli never again, which predicated instead a state of the Jews, albeit democratic, citizenship not being central, historical reconciliation deemed to be perhaps impossible, and so forth. And the clash between these two values, which was beginning to be present starting after the years 2000, and which monopolized the entire Jewish world's vision of what Europe was doing everything wrong, is before us to this day, even more acutely so, for those of us who do feel that perhaps some of the constitutional amendments that Benjamin Netanyahu wished to produce could only enforce an ever more ethnic nationalist presence inside the Israeli society. So I will now stop in terms of the past, and forgive me for this quick galloping through these years, and say I've revisited the future of European Jewry. What about the future of this particular entity, which I will not call European Jews as such? I will simply say that we have had a very interesting, ironical development. In 1994, Jews across Europe, excuse me, Jews across Europe were basically, could be defined in the following manner. I can live where I live, but how can Jews possibly live elsewhere? And the elsewhere was always southeast of the country in which one lived. The UK could wonder how one could live in France. The French didn't even accept the notion that there might be Jews in Germany. The German Jews could not imagine that there could be a Polish revival. And then somehow, because of the leftovers of the Cold War, then there was a kind of miracle of Jewish life existing in the Ukraine and the former Soviet Union again, so that it was like a V-shape, downhill all the way to Germany and Poland, and uphill again, perhaps, toward the former Soviet Union. Now, if we look at things today, imagine the irony of a situation where you have Polish Jews who are proud kippah wearers telling the press, I have no problem walking in the streets of Warsaw with my kippah. I would be scared to death in the streets of Paris. We now have a reversal. And when we speak about the UK has become the bastion of what I would call intellectual anti-Semitism. France is the bastion of thuggish anti-Semitism. One provokes or wants to fight for the boycott of Israel. In France, instead, we're violent, and therefore we do horrible things. I mean, in other words, horrible things happen inside the French society against the Jews. And this element, I would say, you could paraphrase it as all better on the Eastern Front. Because somehow, and here I do speak about Hungary, of course Jobbik is frightening, and we have seen the photos, but when I went and gave a lecture to the Hungarian community sent there by, I believe, the European Council of Jewish Communities, about 2 or 3 years ago, I was very wary of what I was going to say because I felt very much ill at ease in the Hungarian context. And I began to say, well, you know, anything of my categories doesn't fit here. And so I'm really quite, you know, scared to say anything. And the people started telling me about all the horrors in Hungary. So the following morning, I gave a second lecture in which I lifted the tone in terms of democratic principles, at which point they all shouted me out saying, Hungary is our country, and stop criticizing it. And then when I asked some of the people there, I says, well, we Jews enjoy the thrill of living in Hungary. And I don't want to be, this is not a joke. It is a feeling that each national community has understandings and comes to understand where it sits and how it works and how it lives in ways that other countries do not necessarily understand. We are in a situation of the all quiet on the Eastern Front that just follows. After 10 years of acrimonious debate, the Museum of the Polish Jews has finally opened to dithyrambic effects. And not unlike the museum, the Jewish Museum of Berlin, but in 2001. Even then, in 2001, the opening actually coincided with 9/11. But anyway, here we have Polish interest, Polish love of life, and of Jewish things Jewish, as Ruth would say. And what's happening in France? You have extreme Frenchmen, Jews, who feel so completely alienated from France that what they're saying basically is, and I'm quoting someone who actually quoted Stanislas de la Clermont-Tonnerre, the 1789 French deputy who famously said, to the Jew as an individual, everything, to the Jew as a nation, nothing. By simply saying, France today, everything for dead Jews, nothing for living Jews. This is the situation as seen from some of the more extremist voices in the French setting. How can one imagine saying that while living freely as a citizen in a democracy with a state that actually is on the side of protecting the Jews? There is something again there of a trauma, of an angst, of a fear that while objectively it is dangerous and there are problems, has thrown out the baby, the bathwater, the geographical coordinates, and an entire post-war European period as though it were just junk or vanilla ice cream and one likes chocolate. So now, I would like to end with a few personal historical reflections, and after the joy and the merrymaking, make 2 reflections on what I would call the tragedy and why, somehow, I think that Europe and the Jews amongst it still have a vital role to play. The tragedy, and here I will make a historical mea culpa, but not because I did something wrong at that point, but the world and the times are changing. I really did believe that Holocaust commemoration was going to give Jews across Europe a very important role and understanding and differentiate them from American Jews on one end and Israelis on the other. They were living in the land where the perpetrators had lived. They were seeing how the new generations of Europeans were coming to grips and trying to understand the Holocaust in what I call the second coming of the Holocaust of the 1990s, one could make a distinction between the way, if you remember, the 50th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz was celebrated in 1995 under Wałęsa, who was still stuck in Polish martyrology and practically could not utter the word Jew in his official speech as he spoke in front of the Auschwitz concentration camp, and simply was speaking about the Polish martyrology, to the point that German President Roman Herzog and the American Jews present walked out and did a separate ceremony in Birkenau to honor the Jewish victims. 10 years later, the whole 60th anniversary ceremony took place in Birkenau. Simon Weil represented the French voice, Władysław Bartoszewski, the Polish one, as a number 2, and there was a representative of the Sinti. And in those 10 years, one need not be an optimist. One has to understand what it means for pluralist democracy to see what Europe has done. Now, where is my mea culpa, or rather my historical reflection? I think I was, and I think I'm not the only one, perhaps too optimistic. And there was a feeling that because of the birth of the State of Israel on one end, the new Europe on the other, and an entirely different world, the Holocaust and all its horrors could come back, and one could treat it, and bridges could be made. I have now taken a much more tragic take on this. It took 2.5 centuries for the Jewish world to come out of the trauma of the expulsion from Spain. And this trauma didn't just concern my ancestors, but it went through every single shtetl in Poland and elsewhere. I'm afraid that we're only at the beginning of this Holocaust trauma, that we may have still a century or a century ahead, half ahead, because the Holocaust has one subset, and that subset, unlike what the original hope was, is Israel. Israel has not been the normality of giving a normal place for the Jews finally, but it's becoming an abnormality and a dangerous place for the whole notion of the Jewish angst. And consequently, I fear that one is having ahead of us a century, perhaps even more, of the resonance of the Holocaust, if only because the more non-Jews came toward us, the Jews, the more the slight differences, the narcissism of difference, small differences, but your complete emotional differences, has woken up and come out. And now, as Europe goes beyond to treat other problems and other issues, the Jews may still be stuck with the Holocaust, hardly digested. So this is my real feeling that 20 years ago, I did not think like this at all. So this would be the first element. The second element is Israel's own development. The squaring of the circle of the Jewish and democratic state worked for a long time because it was assumed that things would get better. I'm afraid they're not. And this squaring of the circle, which was put off to a distant future, may be coming to the point where the complexity of the identities, the built-in structures and tensions of Israeli society make it so that, in my opinion, the number of Jews moving here or there, the fact that Israel is now 47% of world Jewry, the fact that it's a strong, dynamic economic country, does not really make a major difference with respect to the fears and the challenges of the democratic context. This is the second element that really worries me and brings me back to what I would call, so what about Europe? It's not an issue of how many different stripes of Jews one has across Europe, how well they live or how not badly well they live. It's more that perhaps it is here, in this complex pluralist nebula, where Jews must take a stand, defend their identities, defend their rights, and perhaps feel that they can win the battle in this continent. Nothing is less certain. There is the medieval fear, there is also the demographic fear, and there is the fear of the absolute other. In Hungary, you may still have Jobbik, but in Western Europe, Jews fear the Muslim presence. And in reality, what you see in the Muslim presence, in great part, is also a repercussion of what is happening in the Middle East. There are thugs, there are criminals, there are anti-Semites, there are dangerous people. But to make the conflation that Europe is anti-Semitic is an insult to me, to the memory of those who perished in the Shoah. So let me end with just a little bit of a reflection. It's nice to reread oneself and start thinking about oneself in the past. I've come to the conclusion, and I know it's not fashionable to refer to the Enlightenment, that the first European post-war project was basically the notion of the Kantian structure of eternal peace. We could see it that way in the structures that were created. And now, trying to give meaning and sense to the years 1989-2000, I would like to think of it, from a European perspective, as a second Kantian moment, but the special moment in which the Enlightenment that the Jews, many Jews so abhorred, actually created an Enlightenment in which the Jews were taken into account. The Jewish past, the Jewish presence, the meaning, the space, the commemorations. So everything could have been perfect from there on. It did not, for the reasons I've outlined before. But that second Kantian moment, is it worth fighting for or not? As I speak to you, many Jews across Europe are no longer interested in the democratic contract. Many Jews feel they're living here, but tomorrow they'll be in Melbourne or Boston or Tel Aviv or who knows where. There's no such interest. Perhaps it's my own small provincial view, but I really do think that the fight is worth fighting here. And why? Because there are now almost two Jewish peoples in the making, and I think that the Israelis who are fighting for democratic values deserve our support. Israelis come to Europe and speak to Europeans. They don't even bother going to speak to most of the Jews, and certainly to none of the Jewish communities. If we really feel that we're living complex, rich, anguished lives with the problem of terrorism and the Muslims, of course, I'm not minimizing that by any stretch of the imagination. I just want to ask you a further question. If one can think of doing this, this, and that across Europe, then is it still worth fighting for as a space? Should we not be welcoming and helping our Israeli cousins who are fighting out there for the same kind of values? Let us not kid ourselves. We have an ethno-nationalist alternative as a Jewish identity. Do we want it? Or should we use this European space as a place in which many of the democratic currents can come together? It's a European, it's a Jewish, and I would say it's a universal issue. And in a sense, what I heard, and I was very interested to see, when I think of that young man on the slide who turned his back saying, I'm not so interested in having this Jewish identity with its possible overtones of, I'm proud to be Jewish, no more mixing with anyone. Perhaps this is our task across Europe as Jews, to revive that old humanistic, perhaps universal Jewry. If it is revived, then Hitler will have really lost. Thank you.